how aware they are of their child. But I think the biggest factor, regardless of generation, is the amount of communication you have about the difficult things that are going on. Are you talking about anger? Are you talking about sadness? Are you talking about disappointment? Are you talking about generational trauma? Are you talking about, hey, you heard us fighting? Like, hey, you heard your parents fighting last night. What were your thoughts about that? Are we keeping that under covers and saving it at night and hoping the kids are falling asleep and they're not listening to that, right? Right. So it's all comes down to that communication factor. And if that's set up in the household to feel like a safe place to talk about it, if you got angry, what's going on? Why are you getting angry? Why are you throwing stuff? What's going on? This looks so bad. This looks so bad. You're not going to get into a good college. You're going to get in trouble. Instead of, why are you angry? What's going on? Did something feel hurtful? Did something feel unjustified? Did something feel disappointed? Right? It's a difference in how you look at a behavior, because when we're not talking about mental health, then those behaviors are the form of communication. And if parents are acknowledging and witnessing behaviors and speaking to it, that makes all the difference.
Another episode of the Speak Real podcast, sharing one-on-one conversations. We believe that storytelling is the best way to empower youth and give them the platform to find their voices.
Presented by YouthSpeak. Youth experience, youth voice, youth empowered.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Speak Real podcast, brought to you by YouthSpeak Canada Charities. Well, I just want to give a shout out, as always, to our sponsor, TD Bank, for always supporting us in all of our creative endeavors, such as the podcast that you're watching right now, and our IG lives that do happen bi-weekly on Tuesdays. So make sure to follow us everywhere. Alrighty, without further ado, I would like to bring on the guest here for today's podcast. She goes by the cultural therapist. She is a first-generation bicultural American, and she did go into therapy for be able to provide assistance to those who may be sharing her kind of experiences. So we're going to go ahead here and introduce. So now I'm going to let the one and only cultural therapist welcome in here and introduce herself. Alrighty, yo, come on. Let everybody know who you are.
Hi everyone. My name is Ghazal. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I practice in California. I have a private practice called Break the Cycle Multicultural Therapy, where I see first and second generation young adults, older adults, and honestly, like anyone who's interested in meeting with me for relational therapy and culturally affirming relational therapy.
Okay, awesome. Now, of course, I do have a question about your practice, but we'll get to that later on. But I mean, of course, we got to start off with some of the adventures. So you're very open about being bicultural. So I was wondering, what's it like being bicultural, and were there any impacts to your mental health from these experiences? Now, of course, if just share what you're comfortable with, but let us know.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm bicultural, and basically being bicultural is kind of like having this split, or even multicultural is kind of feel like holding kind of the space in between two different identities, one from your family of origin. So my parents are from Pakistan and India, and then I was born and raised in the US. So I'm kind of growing up with that more Americanized cultural identity as well. So having a bicultural identity is kind of navigating both your family of origin identity and parts of that, as well as like working towards like figuring out who you are in your setting and where you're born and raised. So that's kind of what the bicultural identity is.
Was there ever any like issues with that though? Like, do you feel like, growing up? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What can you share about it?
I think, especially like being in my 30s, it's a little bit, I think that mental health accessibility and talking more about generational issues is a lot more accessible now with the younger generation. But I think like being a millennial, being in my 30s, being in a time when, and this may also be similar for people who are younger, when you have parents who are just struggling to survive in a new country and assimilating to a new country, you are witnessing that, right? So you're witnessing their struggle to assimilate to being in America and like redefining their bicultural identity and who they are. What do I keep from my country of origin and from my family and culture? And how do I blend in order to survive in this new country and basically come down to like taking care of my family, right? Because growing up, that was something that they needed to do to survive, right? To blend in, to not be too loud, to not make a scene. So I think that there was a lot of influence from watching them with that struggle. And then also for me as well, what parts of my identity can I show? What parts of my cultural identity can I feel proud of? And then where do I also, when that gets internalized, where do I also want to hide or isolate or not share, right? I went for a long time, I went by the name Giselle versus my name Ghazal, because I didn't want to get picked on. I didn't want to get bullied growing up in school, right? If I go by Ghazal, people are trying to pronounce it. People were, hey, 90s kids were mean, okay? It's not the same.
Oh, I know.
You know this. Like,
Yeah.
they'll laugh at you right when you get called the wrong name in class, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. Ready to jump on anything.
Exactly, ready to jump. And like, and or even like just like wearing like my clothes from my custom, from my culture, and like not wanting to stand out in that way, trying to assimilate to culture in order to, in their way of survival and my way of almost like not being picked on or bullied or standing out or being different growing up. So I think in those ways, that's where it really showed up for me in my childhood and into my teen years. And now it may show up in different ways, but that's kind of how I grew up, struggling with my identity and who I was versus like assimilating to what I thought was normal and what you saw on TV. And what you saw on TV was generally
It's white people. It's okay. We could say it. Yes, it's fine. I mean, just for anybody watching here, if you go back and watch, like, what's the one I saw recently? Do you remember that slip and slide? Do you remember that? Do you remember that, right? You're in the backyard and you put water on it, you can slide it. Okay, of course, I only fantasize about it. I thought it was only for rich white kids, so I never got to go on that. But if you go and check that commercial,
yes,
it's all white people.
I believe it.
Not all of it. And I remember seeing this come up on social media. I'm like, that's not possible. And then I went back and checked a couple of 90s commercials, and lo and behold,
absolutely,
you would never see brown people on there. That's not happening. It really sucked. You don't notice this.
Yeah, maybe one token brown person, but not.
Yeah.
Maybe for Indians, maybe like the person in healthcare.
Yeah, right. Oh my God, like it's terrible. See, it's great that we're evolving from that now. Like we can look back and laugh at it now because we're finally making steps towards like we're progressing from this, right? But at that time when you're a child, you're internalizing all these things. You don't really realize it. So even something as simple as your name, you know, it's true. It's very true. Like when I was, you know, I mean, obviously I'm lucky. The name Christian is not really like that bad, but I still internalized white culture and I would still prefer the name Chris when I grew up all the way up until high school, right? Because in Hispanic culture, Christian is like how they say my name, but I wanted to be Chris, you know, I want to be right. So I totally get you on that. It's really terrible. I was wondering though, if you don't mind sharing, like what age did you come to America like, as an immigrant?
Yeah, so I'm a child of immigrants, but I was born and raised in America.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. So then you had to see, all right, so that still brings its own challenges because then that means you growing up in American culture, but your parents want you to be in their culture. So I gotta ask, I mean, I don't know if it's, no, we could. What happened there? Like, what was like the first rebellious step you ever taken where you'd be like, no, this is me, you know, this is the American me?
Oh my gosh, the first rebellious step would probably be just like, it's like in the silliest way, it's probably like grabbing my mom's like hair bleach and like going upstairs and dyeing my hair blonde, like, right?
No.
Or like piercing my own ears as like a kid in like my room and like, or trying to go through that Avril Lavigne phase and get a tie on. Like,
yes, let's go, Avril Lavigne.
Like, all of it, like, oh gosh, like I think that's what would be called like my rebellion or my teenage angst at that time, was probably those little things. So probably my earliest stages of like trying to navigate that.
Oh my goodness, that must have been something else. Yeah. So for people who have like immigrant parents, you would know they can never see you have a different hair color, a piercing. Oh no, you're the kid if you do that. So I recall those moments with my older sister having to experience that.
Right. I mean, just trying to get Lunchables versus like taking food from home.
Yeah, that's true. I would take a ham sandwich, that plain white bread, ham on it, as long as it made me you know, a part of the kids. If I came with something exotic, no way, I'm not trying to get laughed at. There's no way. It's true when she says 90 kids were mean, like but I also want to touch upon that mental health, you know, for cohorts that experience that. You and I being millennials, yeah, growing up, it wasn't easy. Like you, if you were mentally ill or you were suffering depression or anything, it was kind of like just, suck it up, right? That was like the big thing. Like, oh, get over that. Oh, it's okay. It's just a phase and this and that,
I don't
now
even
I
think there was language for that.
yeah, that's true actually.
There was
Yeah,
no
really.
or depression or anxiety growing up, right? It was your
Those are
worry.
technical terms. Yeah,
It
those are
was
technical terms. You don't just bring that up.
yeah, yeah. And there
So
was
it
no
was
room for those conversations either. If you really
yeah.
think about it, discussing difficult emotions, discussing how is your day going, right? It was more of like, well, I don't mean to segue because I'm sure these questions are going to come up again, but
Yeah,
like,
of course.
just like the conversations around you go to school, you come back, what's next? Do your homework. Okay, now watch TV, done, next day, right? There was no, how was your day at school? Right? Like, what did you do? Well, there was, what did you do? But it wasn't like, how did that make you feel? Right?
No
On a
way.
bad grade, there wasn't a, it's okay, it's gonna be okay, like it's gonna be okay, or like
No way.
it just wasn't there. There was no language to even have those type of conversations in my experience growing up.
Yeah, no, of course. Especially with immigrant parents, they come here and well, I'm from Canada, but regardless, North America, same culture. It's they come here, they want to provide us a better life, and education is a big one for them. So if you come home with a bad grade, oh, it don't matter how you've been feeling. It better be an A or else, maybe a B, they might be okay with you. But
Right.
oh my goodness, anything below that is a problem, right? And that's back to the cultural clash that we're talking about, right?
Practical, and also like the pressure that's on them, right? Because like they've come to this country to give us opportunities to succeed. So when they see like something so tangible as like a grade not being up to par, it's going to bring up anxiety for them. And if we don't know how to communicate what's coming up for us, and that's going to show up in yelling, fighting,
Oh
getting
yeah.
things taken away from you, right? Like it's not going to be shown the way it should be expressed.
That actually just reminds me of the other thing too, in terms of like child upbringing and stuff. Getting spanked and stuff like that. Hey, to those immigrant parents, that's cultural norm. But over here, of course, as we progressed and we started getting better research for like psychological development, we realized that those are not the ways to go. But it was very difficult to relay that to immigrant parents at the time, especially during like the 90s. They just weren't having it. So that's another very difficult thing. It was difficult, especially, so I'm just thinking in my mind, like, especially being bicultural, having to balance that. Yeah, and we did touch upon the mental health aspect. So I do want to ask this part. So within the South Asian community, how is mental health gauged?
Right. So like that's just such a good question. And like I don't want to generalize like how it is within the whole community because there's like a billion of us.
Of course, of course.
um, but I think in general, I feel like mental health is looked at as something that you keep under wraps and you don't really discuss with people, right? If your kid's going to therapy, it's generally looked at like, oh, they're a problem kid or something's wrong or they're struggling with something. So like you're not telling people, oh, my child's going to therapy, or even as like a young adult or a teen, you're probably being told not to say it, and you're probably at least like the last 10 years, like you weren't that comfortable discussing getting mental health, if that's even something that's happening in the first place. Usually it's more like going to your imam, right? Or like maybe going to family and community, going to an elder, going to your cousins, keeping it within the family. In collectivistic communities, it is this feeling of going to people within the community to get that solved, right? Or making it like a family meeting. If again, so like I'm speaking now, mental health therapy, if that's happening, it's probably being done in secret because it's something that's ashamed of. Now, talking about the family, if it's even happening within the larger aspect of your family, that's a bigger thing. And if it's even being discussed in the first place and being acknowledged as a whole thing. So there's so many layers before you're even talking about discussing mental health, where there's so much more placement on protecting family and community and those factors.
I agree with that so much. If you like, yeah, as you said, I really want to talk about how you're saying under wraps. It's true. It was like a family secret.
Yeah.
You can't let people know about that because then it brings shame to the family, right? Like because mental health wasn't really touched upon during that time, it was as if those were excuses. That's another thing too, right? If you felt ill, those are just like mentally ill, excuses. You had to get over that. So therapy, they had to because it was shameful. They didn't want people to be like, why are you wasting time on that? Why are you wasting money on that? Why is your child a problem? Why didn't you raise your kid properly? You know, things like that. It's
Mhm. What
yeah,
are you doing wrong? What are you
yes,
doing wrong as a parent, right? Because everything goes back, your reflection of your child is a reflection of you as a parent,
it's
right?
true. Exactly. Especially when you know how you mentioned before, immigrant parents come here and they want to provide a better life. And if their child is not in a better position as they should be, right? If they're not successful or anything like that, yeah, it goes back to the family. I mean, we can all like it's okay. We know our immigrant families and their extended family. Okay, it's gossip central. All right, they got little group chats and they're all talking about each other. And oh my goodness, I feel bad for them. Okay, I feel bad for them. The, they're as bad as the 90s kids we were talking about. So I know for sure. Yeah, I know for sure that they must be like,
So
yo, my
imagine
kid's
that.
fine.
Imagine that, a bicultural identity where it's like you're going to get picked on at school or you're going to be talked about at home. Like it's like
Yeah.
you can't win. Where are
Yeah.
you safe? Where are you safe potentially with the therapist? No one's talking about going to therapy. No one's and even accessibility to therapy. Like that's still difficult now, to be
It
honest. And
is.
it is. It's not easy to find a therapist, right? Going through insurance companies and all of that. But back then that wasn't even a conversation, to be honest. It wasn't.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
true. Like even now, some benefits are finally starting to. Like I'm lucky mine does. I've yet to use it though, which I should. But oh my goodness. But like at the time when I did need a therapist, it was covered. We have like healthcare, and it was covered. Now not. So our thing constantly changes. And it's one of those regressions almost. You can think of it as like, oh, why is that taken out of healthcare now? Oh, all of a sudden now it's not an important thing, so on and so forth, right? So it's difficult, but I'm glad to see that it is evolving. It's just that unfortunate with some of our like the age of our parents and that whole demographic, it might be a little too late. Some of them do take on and realize and they adopt the change. Many of them are still adamant that hey, you could just be better. You could wake up better.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to be in a place where you can accept that we came from a place when it was a privilege and it's still very much a privilege, right?
So, I was wondering though. So, South Asian culture, I know for sure because like I work at a university. This university primarily does have a lot of South Asian students. So I've seen these parents come in constantly. It's like, I gotta ask about this one. All right. For parents, how closely are they involved within the South Asian community? How involved are they with a child's upbringing?
I I want to say, I want to answer your question like this. I think that it can show up in ways of, and see, I don't want to make a generalization when I say this because I do feel like this is one that's been carried on in media and in different ways where it feels like that Asian parent is the one that's the tiger mom, right? Or like that Asian parent is overbearing and like very authoritative and all about academics. But I will also say that this upbringing is very much focused on how are you doing academically? How well are you doing, right? And maybe the reflection of how your child is doing, engaging their mental health is coming from how they're doing, right? Maybe the conversations start when you see that the grades are off, or when you see that they're maybe isolating, or they're not wanting to socially engage, right? Like I think that it's different for different generations. Maybe 10 years in the past, it was reflected on your grades. Maybe now it's more with like how much you're isolating or how much you're on your phone, right? So I think it depends. It definitely depends on the parent. It definitely depends on how aware they are of their child. But I think the biggest factor, regardless of generation, is the amount of communication you have about the difficult things that are going on. Are you talking about anger? Are you talking about sadness? Are you talking about disappointment? Are you talking about generational trauma? Are you talking about, hey, you heard us fighting? Like, hey, you heard your parents fighting last night. What were your thoughts about that? Are we keeping that under covers and saving it at night and hoping the kids are falling asleep and they're not listening to that, right? Right. So it's all comes down to that communication factor. And if that's set up in the household to feel like a safe place to talk about it, if you got angry, what's going on? Why are you getting angry? Why are you throwing stuff? What's going on? This looks so bad. This looks so bad. You're not going to get into a good college. You're going to get in trouble. Instead of, why are you angry? what's going on? Did something feel hurtful? Did something feel unjustified? Did something feel disappointed? Right? It's a difference in how you look at a behavior, because when we're not talking about mental health, then those behaviors are the form of communication. And if parents are acknowledging and witnessing behaviors and speaking to it, that makes all the difference.
Okay. Well, for me, when I brought up about seeing them a lot at the university, is it's actually not less about the grades and more about like they're kind of overbearing in the sense of they need to be involved with all the details. Oh, did my son or daughter do this application correct? Did they do this? Did they do that? What else do they need to do? They make sure that they're on that and stuff like that. That's more what I meant. And I have heard that happens. Like, is that something that is true, or do you also feel like that's?
I think that the helicopter parenting of like, is my kid like getting all this stuff done? Are they submitting their stuff on time? Right. I think that is a boundary issue, right? That's an issue where it is, are you trusting your child, or honestly your young adult? Are you seeing your child as a young adult now navigating college? That's the first beginning steps to navigating adulthood. Are you witnessing your young adult as a young adult? Are you giving them the independence to navigate this on their own? Do you have the patience? And do you have this sense of anxiety that is associated with control, where if I don't help them with this, and if I don't push them to do this, and if I'm not part of this, then they will not succeed because they do not know any better, right? So it's like, do you have that trust that your child can do this on their own? And how do you develop that trust with your child if you don't allow them to make mistakes in the first place?
Yeah, I love the phrasing about, are you looking at your child as a young adult? It is true, especially when we're thinking about like the university time. That's when, they're about 18 or 19 to get into, college, university. And that's their time that they're supposed to begin to realize, okay, this is adulting. This is the adult life. Things are not handed to me. I have to like make sure I'm on top of my things. And I love how you say that. Are you viewing them like that? Are you viewing them as a young adult? Or are you still looking at them as their like, 8-year-old child that you have to be on top of things and you don't trust them? That's really good. Yeah.
What stories have the parents associated to their child, and how much have they managed their own anxiety and control in relationship to their child and their child's decisions and choice making, right? Large.
Okay. No, that's really good. All right. So then I was wondering, in terms of parents, in terms about the upbringing, I do see that there is a bit of media saturation that's kind of influencing how we think of that. But I was wondering then, now, since you clarified on that matter, what about barriers to your parents' understanding of their child's mental health?
Yeah. I think this all goes back to like being willing to have, there's a lot of value that's placed on, and this is a generational trauma piece here. There's a lot of value placed on protecting the family name, protecting our identity, and protecting how we look like to other people. This also comes from a place of survival for them, right? In order to not be looked at as a problem, or to be a troublemaker, or to be difficult, that then made sure that you secured income, you had a job, you had a livelihood, right? You don't stand out, you blend in. This was the same thing like we experienced generationally growing up, in the same way with hiding our cultural name or our cultural outfits, right? Or our identity. So going back to your question, where is the emphasis placed on protecting the family and what people are going to think? Or is the emphasis placed on having difficult conversations that will bring out difficult feelings that will then have to be processed, and there will be room for that, right? Both sides parents are holding a different anxiety. If I bring up stuff that my kid's having a difficult time, I have to face this. Not only do I have to face how I am as a parent, I have to make a change and heal and unlearn values that have been placed on me and witness that, as well as make room for a relationship like this with my kid, where we're talking about these things. It always comes back down to, are the parents willing to have this type of communication with their children, this very open communication, without it looking like, without them getting personalizing it or getting defensive around, well, you're saying you're struggling with school, or you're not doing well, I've done everything for you, I've given you this, I've been working. They are working, but at the same time, don't personalize it. It's not about you. Well, meet your child where they're at in the time that they're at. And if you can get past that, that can make all the difference.
I really like that. See, this is great getting to speak to someone that's in the field because you really get a lot of good insight. It's true. That's another thing. My parents do that a lot, you know? I don't know if that's an immigrant parent thing, but oh my goodness, if you are doing like poorly or anything, you're feeling down or you're feeling angry, it's always what you were mentioning. It's like a reflection of them. All of a sudden, they're like, whoa, what did I do wrong to you? I given you everything. Why are you doing this? And I really like how you say that, where it's like, no, 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 but it's not about you, right? It's about me, like how I'm feeling and stuff like that. So, and I do also like how you brought up about protecting the family name and the image. See, that's the thing. Like, sometimes those things take a priority over their child's mental health. Sometimes, you know what I mean by that?
This is what comes from a collectivistic culture versus an individualistic culture, right?
That's
Because that
true.
family name is related to, it's not just that child's name, it's the entire family's name, it's the community name, right? So it is a reflection onto them, whereas some parents, maybe in a more individualistic or Western culture, they can maybe separate that too and not personalize it so much. Not always,
Uh,
but more so.
See, that's like, that's what these podcasts are about, man. We get to learn about these things. See, that's great insight. Like, once again, it's true. It's really difficult to sometimes because we're sometimes ethnocentric in the sense that we grew up here. Like, this is our reality. So we look at ourselves. Like, for me, I'll look at my name. I'm Christian. I'm not Mr. Figueroa, like something like that, right? So I understand how that works. But we don't really reflect on it as much because we're here. So
Right.
we're always about, it's about me. It's okay. It's me. It's my, if I screw up, it's my name. It's fine. But to them, it's like, no, no, no. Our whole family's gonna see this. It's a
Yeah.
shame on all of us,
Right. There's
right?
a lot of, I think that's a privilege that comes with being born in the US, is like you're growing up in a very ethnocentric environment,
Hmm.
right? A very individualistic identity. As in a way too, you should be able to develop. If the story of the immigrant child or the first generation child is not figuring out who their identity is, right, and who they are outside of their family, I don't know what is the story or the narrative that we're all trying to figure out here, right? So there should be a healthy level of who am I alongside my family, but that allowance of, as you get older, 18, 19, 20, allowing your young adult, not your child, to figure out who they are themselves, because you learn a lot more about who you are from the experiences that your parents probably don't want you to have.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, most definitely.
All
Um,
predictive, right?
so was speaking about still on this topic for parents, I was wondering then, we did touch upon boundary issues. So I'm wondering, what are some improvements that can be made for boundary issues in terms of parents and their children? I'm
Right.
sure this can be tricky, but what do you got?
No, I think that it's recognizing in ways, like I think it's almost for like the young adult to recognize that their parents may have grown up with what they consider, what they thought was healthy, right? They may have grown up thinking, okay, the parent may grow up thinking like people pleasing, being available to other people, right? Or accepting mistreatment, or being very flexible, very accommodating, right? Not saying no, not upsetting somebody else, right? Being gosh, just over accommodating, people pleasing, not accepting mistreatment. All these things were done to survive, and all these things were also part of the culture, right? This was what made you a good family member, a good person, just a wholehearted good person. But the thing is, those were actually some unhealthy boundaries that were modeled to us growing up, right? So like imagine just giving your parents the language of, hey, I know you grew up thinking that when somebody needed you, you had to drop everything and be available for them, because that's what it meant to be part of the family, part of the community, right? So drop what you needed to do. Like if you had plans that day, you have to let it all go and be available, because if not, then you're not a good sister, right? Or
Mhm.
you're not a whatever it is, right? Versus just letting like the older adult or the young adult teach your parents boundaries around, actually you can limit your time if you still feel like you need to go be available to this person, right? You can still do what you need to do. You can go do what you want to do first and then meet them afterwards. You can pick a different date to be available to them. You don't have to immediately be so available, call up, answer them, and try to help them with their problems, or if they're going through an emotional crisis, right? Almost like reparenting them in a way to let them know like what was thought to you was unhealthy and there are options for you, right? But what happens is we can get lost with, if we grew up in the US or in Canada or outside of our family's origin, that's dumb. You don't need to do that. you need to do what you have to do, right? Like that doesn't matter. They can wait. They're not in that same lens and mindset. So you have to meet them where they're at and understand what's coming up for them without bringing in your own resentments. And that's really hard. And that's where therapy can make a huge difference in understanding how much of me is showing up when I'm speaking to my mom and my resentments, and how much of what's happening for them and their need to be able to do something or be available, and teaching them like you have options. You don't have to be people pleasing or so available. And it doesn't make you look like a bad daughter, sibling, father, mother, all of that.
Oh man, that resentment issue, that's definitely always, it's hard to put that one away, right? A lot of times, especially if you get in a heated discussion with your parents. I'm sure many children know about this. You're gonna be like, oh, because of you doing this, I can't do this, or I couldn't have fun in high school because you always needed me to come home after school, or stuff like that, right? I'm sure there's many more examples. Wow, yeah, but that's good. It brings up discussions.
Right.
That's the thing, communication, right? Like you got to communicate with your parents. If they're being too overbearing, you have to let them know. It's never easy to have an unpleasant conversation. Everyone's had that dread where you have to talk, and this is not just with parents, it's like anybody, any human.
Right. And when you're holding a bicultural identity, you also feel guilt if you have that conversation, right? If you speak to your resentments, you immediately go into, but damn, like, they were also just trying to figure it out themselves. They were in a new country themselves, right? They didn't have the language about mental health or depression or anxiety themselves, right? So like, where do you process all these things, right? Where do you process that resentment of, yes, my parents weren't available for me in this way when I needed them, when they needed to put me in therapy, right? When they needed to ask me how I'm doing, they needed to ask me if I was safe, and what were they facing themselves and figuring out and navigating themselves at the same time. And I think if you can find a space outside of your family, your community, and your friends, where spaces may not feel as safe to speak to that, and your grief around that can make a lot of difference in how you then come back and have that conversation, by just having that understanding. I'm not saying you're forgiving your parents. I'm saying that you're learning to understand both sides of the story, and then finding a way to meet each other halfway in that understanding.
No, it's very nice. It's true. Sometimes we don't really just think about the other perspective. I mean, think about it. Let's try to throw ourselves. Have you ever done these kind of like thought experiments? You're like, what if I just went into that other country? What would I be doing there? Like, I'm gonna throw myself to Germany. I'm gonna toss myself right in Germany. Boom.
Right.
How I can't even fathom like what I'd be doing. Right. First thing I'll be doing is looking for someone who speaks my language.
Right.
But then, you know what I mean? Like, how many times have our parents had to do this? It's crazy, right? We don't really appreciate that sometimes. We don't really think about it, right? So, you got to make sure not to always just yell at them either. Like they did a lot for us, then we don't really think about it. So,
it's okay to remember those things and see those things, and not think then you're denying your feelings or invalidating your experiences by being able to think about those things at the same time. Right.
No, I get what you're saying. It's true. So it's good advice. It's just one of those things where, hey, if you're going to speak to your parents, then at least think about like their perspective first, and then realize, why are they mad, or why would they do this? It's just another insight, and then formulate your opinions.
Yep. And even give language to their experience, because they may not have that either. Right.
That's true.
Do you think that they, and this is me assimilating a whole generation of people, but like, did my mom know that she was in survival mode? Did my mom know that she was struggling with assimilating, or whiteness, or racism, or sexism, right? Did she have this word? Did she know this was happening? Maybe also part of the process of getting older and learning who your parents are in a different way is giving them language that they were not given.
Oh, that's a really good point too. Look at that. Oh, this is such a fun podcast. All right. Well, all right. So this one, I definitely feel like you have a lot to say on as well. So can you speak a bit about generational trauma? You can define it and then let us know some examples of it.
I think the way I look at generational trauma is traumatic events that have probably happened in the previous generation that have affected like the family's well-being in some way, right? It's like, it's traumatic experience that have not been processed, right? And because the protected factors around safety or preoccupation with really just safety and like and community versus like processing things that have been difficult. And I think when generational trauma continues, when we don't have room to decipher what was unhealthy and what was okay and what was unsafe and not okay. And so when generational trauma continues, when we are not examining what are we doing within our family that's unhealthy and repetitive and not breaking like the cycles and like having those difficult conversations around like, when I grew up, right? Like, so I'm talking about like my mom, and she said, when I grew up and I was in school, like when my mom grew up in school, like the teachers were literally hitting them in the hands, like hitting them with like a stick when they got something wrong. So when like my mom's here or my dad's here, and then I'm doing bad in math, it maybe shows up in the same way, maybe not hitting, but yelling or being deprecating in some way, right? But if they don't know that this was wrong in the first place and not just what was expected because of culture, then how do you then break the cycle here? Right. So it's kind of, and then if you don't discuss these things that happen, and this is like threat, this is like an actual threat to someone's physical body. If we're not acknowledging that this was not okay, you're storing that in your body, right? That is showing up as chronic stress, that is showing up as illness, that is probably in South Asian community showing up as diabetes, cholesterol, all the things that we deal with, right? And that gets passed on. So intergenerational trauma is basically saying like how, like, it's the idea of like epigenetics and like how our genes can actually change due to unprocessed trauma, and how our bodies and stress physically change as a trauma response, right? Like the cortisol levels, how we're affected because of these things that have happened to us in the past.
Oh, I love that. Also, we're getting scientific here. Epigenetics. Yeah, that's pretty, that affects many people, right? But it's great how you bring that into a whole collective generational trauma. For example, like you were saying, if South Asians have a certain trauma and they do not process it properly, they'll just hold it in and not express it or deal with it, then their children might have heightened fight or flight responses to certain stimuli that wouldn't have been there in the first place for another culture, right? I wish I could think of a more specific example, but that's great. I never really thought about using that in a cultural manner, and that would make so much sense.
Right, absolutely. I mean, just in like, gosh, there's like so many. I mean, this could even go back to just grief and loss. If you grew up in a country, especially with like South, like my grandmother had like 8-9 kids, right? Like,
oh my goodness,
on both sides, and there were so many miscarriages and so much loss with that. But the duty was bear children, make sons, right? That's your role as a woman. Who talked about all the loss, all the grief, what that took on the body, right? What that then did growing up with your mother, who experienced that, but then never processed that. How did that show up with her kids as she's raising them, right? And then how does that now show up now? So there's different ways to think about it, but that's a really good physical example of unhealed work and leaving things to not be disclosed or talked about. If there's even language around grief and loss when it comes to that, aside from expectation and duty, right?
I love how you constantly bring that up. Make sure the language, that is so important. It's something that we do not even think about could be that important. We might have the words today, but those topics and words may not have been there back then. So that's really true.
10 years ago. Yeah.
Now what about the other side of these things? So there's generational trauma.
Yeah.
Now this has got to be a big one. Is now a bit of a uptrend of Middle Eastern words being used as like memes, but like positive memes. Like, I wish I knew the terms. I see them all the time. But one of the things was, I saw a person tweet and they were saying that they're happy. They're like, please keep using these words like this. I'm glad, because I'm finally happy to see these words be funny. Right? So I'm glad it's, that's starting to show, I'm not saying it's appropriate, but I'm saying that at least it's shedding some, it's showing that this North America is finally starting to shed that fear of Islam away.
Yeah,
at least there's that.
Almost like taking back the word, redefining that word.
Yeah, right. So it's good to see that. So I just wanted to add that, just a little positive note, because I'm sure that must have been a terrible experience for you as well. But thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing your experience. And I know as a man, that must have been even more difficult.
It was annoying, but you get over it. So at least now, what for me, how I like to appreciate is that at least it gave me insight to South Asians and how they must have felt, right? At least it gives me that insight. For I have an appreciation for Islam because I understood it. They're humans. They're humans. So so I got another question here when it comes to your cultural demographic, if you don't mind. Coping skills. Are there anything different with coping skills from like North American culture or your culture?
This is interesting, right? Because coping skills, I look at coping. So you're talking to a therapist here, right? So you're talking to someone, you're talking to someone who's looking at coping skills from the way of ways to self-protect from difficult feelings, emotions, anxiety, shame, guilt, and what's underneath that, core emotions, right? Anger, sadness, hurt, right? Fear, right? So when I hear the word coping skills, I need to, in my mind, reframe that for this conversation as positive, because it is positive, right?
Oh, of course.
But
Yes.
when it's not in denial of your emotions, when you're not coping by overworking, when you're not coping by like overeating or like exercise, because you rather do these things and face what the difficult emotions that are maybe under, right? Like ways to connect to more of this, like more in-depth work around what's coming up for you, right? So now positive. Okay, so let me go there and here where it's like coping skills from a negative outlook can be when you're using it as a way to self-protect or distract from more difficult things that you're struggling with, whether it's internalized shame, guilt, or anxiety, not having clarity about something and the emotions that are attached to that. Healthy coping skills. This can all look the same way as long as they're done in a way where you're not denying what's like feelings and other things that may be attached to the way you're coping, right? So if you're coping with grief or loss by going and working out nonstop, right? And like trying to stay focused. If I just stay focused on this workout or in this class and I focus on cardio, then I'm not like thinking about what's happening for me here. Also, grief and loss is its own thing. And I'm not going to ever judge anyone for coping in any way they need to in any season or chapter of their life to do that. But if you are doing that to not process difficult things versus if you're working out a healthy amount and you're also maybe like assessing what's happening for you versus going to food versus going to things to cope with it, that's different, right? It's all balance. So I had to reframe the way I was looking at coping.
Well, what about for your culture? Is there anything specific, or is it?
I would say
like I like how you bring up overworking. Is that something that's within your culture? Because I know for sure.
I think so. I think that this is, and this also goes back to this like inherited idea of like perfectionism, right? This idea of like what is enough when there's overworking by itself is shoulds. I should be doing this. I should be getting this done. I shouldn't be taking care of myself. I shouldn't go out on the weekend, right? I should. That's an unhealthy way of coping. Start tracking when your shoulds are coming up, right? That's a huge one. I think another one is it's so hard, right? It's so hard to like,
yeah, of course. I'm sorry.
No, but that's something that I need to recognize. It's like, coping should be being able to go to community. Coping should be being able to have these discussions with family. Coping should be having support. Coping should be taking time off, right? But like, because of my lens of working with people from South Asian backgrounds, from children of immigrant backgrounds, and from just people who are struggling with the other side of it, I've always like, coping for me is how they're self-protecting from issues that are really coming up because the communication isn't there and the community support isn't there to feel safe to do these things. Coping should be being able to talk to your family, being able to get support, being able to go to therapy, right? Being able to go run, work out, eat healthy, enjoy these things. Coping shouldn't be doing things overly working, like isolating yourself, not talking to people because you're not trying to face other things.
All right, well, there you go. So I do have one last question because I feel like a lot of this discussion has led to this. So I just want to know if I was correct.
Okay.
What inspired you to start your own practice?
Everything I just said for the last hour. No, but when it came down to it, I really I needed to be the person that I needed. I needed to be the change that I wanted to see in my society, in my community, in my family, right? Growing up with that, a bicultural identity is not a bad thing, but when you are separating yourself or living a double life because of internalized shame that comes from one culture, or bullying and experiences that come from one culture, and you don't feel safe, and then you can't express that because, like I said, you don't know if one's going to gossip, the other one's going to bully you, right? Where do I feel safe? So I think what came for me with like wanting to be a therapist and acknowledging like these first and second generation struggles, these grapples with gender and social and cultural expectations, these influences of colonialism, growing up in America, growing up in Canada, growing up with immigrant parents, this need to individuate and figure out your identity and who you are. I think all of this was things that honestly I just needed when I was that age and I was going through it. So if I can be that for a younger generation or anyone or someone even my age, then, and someone can feel seen and I can be open and honest. And I'm the type of person where I will talk to you about these things, right? I'm not as reserved about the things I've experienced, because I think that one thing that happens in our community that perpetuates the shame cycle is being reserved about shit that went wrong and didn't work out, right? Being able to have those conversations in a space with someone who can speak to it and already see it makes all the difference in understanding, right? My story is not the same, but it's a familiar experience. And if you can look at me and you can identify that and you can see that, you looked at me and you're like, yeah, you've been through some shit, right? Like, it's like you saw that, right? And look at how much conversation we had and look what we talked about just in having that lived experience together. That's why I became a therapist.
That's beautiful. I love that. So I had a feeling, I'm like, okay, there's no way. There had to be a story behind this. No one just chooses to do this. And yeah, it's great to hear that it's true, because honestly, people need to understand, especially for our generation growing up, it was lonely in the sense that you couldn't really talk about these things. So now you are doing that. You are empowering the next generation to not have to feel that. And that's great.
Break the cycle. Talk about it.
Exactly.
Yes.
All right, well, I just want to thank you so much here for being on Speak Real podcast. Honestly, it was a great time. And I loved hearing your stories, and you have a lot of incredible insight. I'm sure you're going to do so amazing in your practice. And remember, guys, if you need someone to talk to, please, you got one right here. So there you go.
Follow me on The Cultural Therapist.
Oh yeah,
Instagram.
It's super nice. I love it. Yeah, a lot of funny skits there too. So it's definitely great. So definitely check her out. So closing remarks. Thank you for watching Speak Real podcast here, provided by YouthSpeak Canada, and a big shout out to TD Bank for sponsoring this episode. And without just for any last words, where can they find you again?
Yes. So you can follow me on my Instagram, The Cultural Therapist. I will also be opening up my private practice in the fall under my name, Ghazal Abbas, LMFT, or Break the Cycle Multicultural Therapy. You can find that on Psychology Today. But I think the best way to connect with me is through my Instagram. And then we can go from there.
Awesome. Alrighty. Thank you so much once again. And thanks for anybody who's listening. Have an awesome day.
You got this.
If you want to hear more stories, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like. To support more youth by youth led projects, visit us at youthspeak.ca, where you can donate and spread youth mental health awareness.
YouthSpeak Performance Charity. Speak, inspire, change.